We hold these truths to be self-evident.
We are here to declare our right to equality. We are here today to discuss a new Declaration of Independence for women.
Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. First major women's rights meeting. Imagine, if you will, a small town nestled in the heart of upstate New York. The year is 1848, and the place is Seneca Falls. At first glance, it's just another dot on the map, a quiet industrial town humming with the steady rhythm of progress. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and industry, a unique blend of nature and human endeavor. This isn't a bustling metropolis like New York City or a political powerhouse like Washington, D.C. No, Seneca Falls is something different. It's a town of hardworking people, of mills powered by the rushing Seneca River, of barges gliding silently along the newly dug canals that crisscross the region like lifelines, connecting this small community to the wider world. Life here is dictated by the seasons and the shift whistle. It's a place of modest homes, muddy streets, and the constant underlying thrum of machinery shaping the American landscape. But if you listen closely, beyond the churn of the water wheels and the clatter of the factories, you can hear something else. A whisper, a low, persistent murmur of change. This is the mid-19th century, an era crackling with new ideas and fervent energy. It's a time of great awakenings, not just in faith, but in social consciousness. People are starting to question the world around them, to look at a society built on tradition and ask why? All across the North, the abolitionist movement is gaining momentum, its passionate calls for an end to slavery echoing from church pulpits to town squares. Temperance societies are forming, determined to combat the social ills of alcohol. Utopian communities are springing up, experiments in living a better, more equitable life. This entire region, known as the Burned-Over District, is a hotbed of religious revivalism and social reform. It's as if the very soil is fertile for radical new thoughts. And these ideas aren't just abstract concepts discussed by intellectuals in far-off cities. They're in the air in Seneca Falls. They are talked about over dinner tables, debated in general stores, and pondered in the quiet moments after a long day's work. The canals and the new railroad lines don't just carry goods. They carry newspapers, pamphlets, and people, all bearing these seeds of transformation. Among the residents of Seneca Falls are women who, while managing their households and raising their children, are also reading, thinking, and talking. They see the energy of the anti-slavery movement and they begin to wonder about their own place in society. They are citizens, yet they cannot vote. They are property owners, yet their legal rights are severely limited. They are the moral backbone of the community, yet their voices are largely unheard in the halls of power. There's a growing sense of dissonance, a feeling that the great American experiment of liberty and justice for all has left half the population behind. This sentiment isn't loud or aggressive, not yet. It's a quiet, simmering frustration, a shared understanding that passes between women in a knowing glance, a shared sigh, a letter exchanged between friends. It's a sense that the world is on the cusp of something, that the grand promises of the revolution have yet to be fully realized. And it's here, in this unlikely setting, not in a grand state capital or a major cultural center, but in a small, unassuming town of mills and canals, that the pieces are falling into place. It's a place where the hum of industry provides a backdrop for the hum of intellectual revolution, where the waters of the Seneca River are about to witness a different kind of power being unleashed. History is rarely a thunderclap. More often, it's a slow-building pressure, a convergence of people, place, and time. In the summer of 1848, the pressure in Seneca Falls is reaching a critical point. The quiet conversations are about to become a public declaration. The unspoken frustrations are about to be given a voice, a powerful, articulate voice that will demand to be heard. What was it about this specific time and this specific place that allowed such a monumental shift to occur? Was it the network of reformers crisscrossing the state? Was it the spirit of independence fostered by a town built on hard work and innovation? Or was it simply the courage of a handful of individuals who decided that the time for silence was over? As we delve into this story, we'll find that it's a combination of all these things and more. We are about to witness the moment when a local grievance, a personal frustration, becomes a national movement. A moment when a tea party among friends sparks a revolution that continues to shape our world today. A stage is set. The actors, mostly unknown to the wider world, are in place. The quiet town of Seneca Falls, with its muddy streets and its forward-thinking undercurrents, holds its breath. It doesn't know it yet, but it's about to become the birthplace of a struggle for equality that will span generations. History is about to be made, not with the clash of swords, but with the rustle of paper, the scratching of a pen, and the brave, clear voices of women who decided it was time to speak. This is the story of how that happened. So, let's step back in time to the soft, hazy summer of 1848 and walk the streets of this quiet town on the verge of making a very loud noise. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you find this story as fascinating as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue to bring these important moments in history to life. We've got so much more to explore together. Picture this. It's 1848 in America. The air is buzzing with change, a mix of excitement, ambition, and deep, simmering tension. This isn't just a year. It's a crossroads, a moment where the young nation is looking in the mirror and asking, who are we and who do we want to become? Let's journey back and explore this pivotal time together. On the surface, democracy seemed to be booming. The idea of government by the people was spreading like wildfire. More white men, regardless of how much property they owned, were gaining the right to vote. It was a huge step forward from the early days of the Republic, where political power was concentrated in the hands of the wealthy elite. Andrew Jackson's presidency had championed the common man, and that spirit was still very much alive. Political rallies were huge, passionate events, almost like modern-day music festivals, with parades, banners, and fiery speeches. People felt involved. They believed their voices mattered, and they were eager to participate in shaping their country's destiny. But if you look just a little closer, you'd see the cracks in this democratic ideal. The people in government by the people was a very exclusive club. For starters, if you were a woman, your voice was completely silenced in the political arena. You couldn't vote, you couldn't hold office, and your legal identity was often absorbed by your husbands. And for African Americans, the situation was far more dire. In the South, millions were enslaved, treated as property with no rights at all. Even in the North, where slavery was mostly abolished, free black individuals faced rampant discrimination, segregation, and were often denied the right to vote. So, while democracy was expanding for some, it was being actively denied to millions of others. This glaring contradiction was the great unspoken hypocrisy at the heart of the nation. This tension wasn't just sitting there, though. It was fueling one of the most dynamic periods of social change in American history, the era of reform. People weren't just passively accepting the status quo. They were actively trying to fix society's problems. Driven by a powerful wave of religious fervor known as the Second Great Awakening, this wasn't a quiet, contemplative faith. It was loud, passionate, and deeply personal. Preachers at massive outdoor revivals urged people to cast off sin and actively work to create a better world, a heaven on earth. This religious energy lit a fire under a whole host of reform movements. The most explosive of these was, without a doubt, the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists weren't just saying slavery was a bad system. They were calling it a profound moral sin that was corrupting the soul of the nation. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison with his newspaper, The Liberator, and Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave whose powerful speeches and writings exposed the brutal reality of bondage, were relentless. They used moral persuasion, political lobbying, and heartbreaking personal testimonies to demand the immediate and unconditional end of slavery. This wasn't a popular position, even in the North. Abolitionists were often seen as dangerous radicals, facing angry mobs and violent opposition. But their moral clarity was undeniable, and their voices were getting louder and louder, forcing the issue of slavery into the national spotlight where it could no longer be ignored. Alongside abolitionism, the temperance movement was gaining incredible momentum. To us, it might seem strange to focus so much on alcohol, but in the 1840s, alcohol consumption was staggeringly high. Many reformers saw it as the root of all social evils: poverty, crime, domestic abuse, and workplace accidents. The temperance movement was a crusade to save the American family and society from the demon rum. They organized lectures, distributed pamphlets with dramatic titles like The Drunkard's Progress, and persuaded millions to sign pledges of total abstinence. It was a movement that crossed class lines and was especially prominent among women, who often bore the brunt of alcohol-related problems at home. They saw temperance as a way to protect their families and create a more stable, moral society. But the winds of change weren't just social and political, they were economic. The Industrial Revolution was transforming America from a nation of small farms and workshops into an industrial powerhouse. Factories were sprouting up, particularly in the Northeast, powered by new technologies like the steam engine and the cotton gin. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were exploding in size as people flocked from the countryside and from overseas in search of work. This shift was creating immense new wealth and opportunities, but it was also fundamentally changing the way people lived and worked. For men, this new industrial world created a new ideal of masculinity. The workplace was no longer the farm or the artisan's shop next to the home. It was the factory, the office, the counting house, a competitive, public sphere separate from domestic life. A man's success was increasingly measured by his ability to earn a wage, to climb the ladder, and to provide for his family. This created a high-pressure environment where men were expected to be ambitious, tough, and relentlessly focused on the bottom line. The home, in turn, became a refuge from this harsh world, a place of peace and rest that he would return to at the end of the day. And who was in charge of that refuge? The women. The Industrial Revolution carved out a new, distinct role for middle-class women, often referred to as the cult of domesticity. While men went out into the public world to work, women were expected to preside over the private domestic sphere. Their role was to make the home a haven of piety, purity, and comfort. They were seen as the moral compass of the family, responsible for raising virtuous children and creating a nurturing environment for their husbands. On one hand, this elevated the role of homemaker and mother to a position of great moral importance. But on the other hand, it confined women to the home, shutting them out of the economic and political life of the nation. Their world shrank even as the nation's was expanding. This brings us to the great unspoken issue of 1848, the deep and pervasive inequality of women. While men were debating the future of the Republic, women had no say. They were legally and socially subordinate to men. A married woman, under the legal principle of coverture, had virtually no individual rights. She couldn't own property in her own name, sign contracts, or even control the wages she might earn. She was, in the eyes of the law, an extension of her husband. Her access to education was limited, and professions were almost entirely closed off to her. She was expected to be passive, obedient, and domestic. But something was stirring. The very ideals of the American Revolution, liberty, equality, and individual rights were starting to resonate with women who saw the hypocrisy in a system that celebrated freedom while denying it to half the population. The reform movements themselves provided a crucial training ground. Women who got involved in the abolitionist or temperance crusades learned how to organize, speak publicly, and petition for change. In fighting for the rights of slaves, they began to recognize their own lack of rights. They saw the parallels. This growing awareness was about to reach a boiling point. In the summer of 1848, in a small town in upstate New York called Seneca Falls, a group of women and a few male supporters would gather for the first ever women's rights convention. They would draft a document, the Declaration of Sentiments, that boldly declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." It was a radical, revolutionary statement that would launch the organized struggle for women's suffrage and equality in America. So, 1848 wasn't just another year. It was a moment of profound transition, a nation grappling with the promises and paradoxes of its own founding ideals. It was a society being reshaped by industry, fired by religious revival, and challenged by brave reformers who dared to imagine a more just and equal world. The debates and struggles of 1848 set the stage for the conflicts and transformations that would define the rest of the 19th century and beyond, shaping the very fabric of the America we live in today. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what part of 1848 you find most fascinating. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through history. In our last chapter, we set the stage. Now, in chapter 3, we're diving deep into the roots of reform. This is where the seeds of change, once dormant, begin to sprout. Imagine the early 19th century. For most women, life was defined by strict social codes. Their world was the home, their role prescribed from birth. But beneath this surface of quiet acceptance, something was stirring. Whispers of doubt and questions about fairness started to emerge. Women began to look at their lives, at the lives of their mothers and daughters, and wondered, is this all there is? Is this truly just? These weren't loud protests yet, but quiet, profound moments of personal awakening. They were the first tremors of a seismic shift to come. A powerful source for these early questions came from a rather unexpected place, the Quaker tradition. The religious society of Friends, or Quakers, held a revolutionary belief for the time, that there is that of God in everyone, regardless of gender. In their meetings, women were not only allowed to speak, but their spiritual insights were valued equally to men's. For women like Lucretia Mott, this wasn't just a religious doctrine. It was lived experience. It was a radical vision of equality that planted a powerful seed. If men and women were equal in the eyes of God, why were they not equal in the eyes of the law and society? This Quaker foundation provided both a moral compass and a community of support for women who dared to envision a different world. Now, let's zoom in on a specific region that became a hotbed for change, upstate New York, in the 1830s and 40s. This area was known as the burned-over district because it was swept by wave after wave of religious revival and social reform movements. It was a place where people were passionately rethinking everything about society. The air was thick with new ideas. This wasn't just about religion. It was about creating a more perfect, more just society on earth. Two of the most powerful movements sweeping through this region were abolitionism and temperance. The fight to end slavery forced many women to confront the very nature of human rights and injustice. As they worked tirelessly to secure freedom for enslaved people, they started drawing parallels to their own situations. They organized petitions, gave public speeches, and managed finances for the cause. In doing so, they stepped far outside their designated domestic sphere and discovered their own political power. They learned how to organize, how to persuade, and how to fight for a cause they believed in. Similarly, the temperance movement, which aimed to curb alcohol consumption, drew countless women into public life. They saw alcohol abuse as a direct threat to their families and homes. It was a cause that was seen as morally acceptable for women to champion, a way to protect the domestic sphere. But in defending their homes, they had to leave them. They had to speak in public, organize meetings, and challenge the status quo. This activism gave them a voice and a sense of collective power they had never experienced before. They were no longer just individuals. They were a force for change. So, in this fertile ground of upstate New York, surrounded by Quaker ideals of equality and energized by the abolitionist and temperance movements, a new kind of consciousness was born, women began to connect the dots. They saw the hypocrisy in fighting for the freedom of others while having so few rights themselves. They were denied education, barred from most professions, and had no legal claim to their own property or even their own children. They were, in the eyes of the law, extensions of their husbands. The quiet whispers were growing louder. The stirrings of discontent were becoming a clear and articulate call for justice. It was no longer enough to quietly accept their place. It was no longer enough to hope for a better future. The time had come to demand one. These were the roots of reform deeply planted in personal conviction, nourished by spiritual equality, and strengthened through the shared struggle for a better world. The stage was now set for these determined women to take their first bold step onto the national stage, a step that would lead them to a small town called Seneca Falls and change the course of history forever. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what happens next. If you're finding this journey as fascinating as I am, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss chapter 4. I'll see you then. Welcome back to our channel, where we explore the lives of history's most influential figures. Today, we re-diving into the story of a woman whose voice ignited a revolution for half of the population, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She wasn't just a part of the women's rights movement. She was one of its principal architects, a thinker, a writer, and a relentless advocate who dared to imagine a world where women were seen as equals. Her journey is one of courage, intellect, and an unshakable belief in justice. So, how did a woman from a privileged background become one of the most radical voices for change in the 19th century? Let's find out. Elizabeth Cady was born in 1815 in Johnstown, New York, into a world of contradictions. Her father, Daniel Cady, was a prominent judge and congressman, which meant Elizabeth grew up surrounded by law books and political discourse. Unlike most girls of her time, she received an excellent education, first at Johnstown Academy and later at the Troy Female Seminary. She was a brilliant student, excelling in Greek, Latin, and mathematics. This intellectual environment fostered a sharp, inquisitive mind. Yet, despite her father's position, or perhaps because of it, she became acutely aware of the law's limitations, specifically how it failed women. From a young age, Elizabeth would spend hours in her father's law office, listening to the stories of women who came seeking help. She heard heartbreaking accounts of women who had no legal right to their own property, their wages, or even their own children after a separation. She saw how the law, a system her father upheld, treated married women as little more than the property of their husbands. One story that deeply affected her was that of a distraught woman who had lost her inheritance simply because her husband had squandered it, and she had no legal recourse. Elizabeth, just a child, was so outraged that she reportedly threatened to take a pair of scissors and cut all the discriminatory laws out of her father's books. Her father had to explain that laws couldn't be changed that way, but the seed of rebellion had been planted. This early exposure to legal injustice shaped her entire life's work. In 1840, her life took a pivotal turn when she married Henry Brewster Stanton, an abolitionist activist. The marriage itself was a statement. At the ceremony, she insisted the word "obey" be removed from her vows, a radical act for the time. Her marriage to Henry plunged her directly into the heart of the reform movement sweeping the nation. They spent their honeymoon at the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London, and it was there that Elizabeth's passion for women's rights truly crystallized. At the convention, she was shocked and infuriated to discover that the female delegates, including the esteemed Lucretia Mott, were denied seating and a voice in the proceedings simply because they were women. They were relegated to a curtained-off gallery, silenced and made invisible. For Elizabeth, this was the ultimate hypocrisy. Here were men fighting for the freedom of one group of people while actively suppressing another. She spent hours talking with Lucretia Mott, a seasoned Quaker minister and abolitionist. Their conversations were a meeting of minds, Mott's quiet wisdom and experience blending with Stanton's fiery, intellectual energy. They walked the streets of London, discussing theology, the nature of injustice, and the urgent need for a movement dedicated solely to the rights of women. It was there, in London, that they made a pact. Upon their return to America, they would hold a convention to advocate for women's rights. That promise, made in 1840, took 8 years to come to fruition. In the meantime, Elizabeth settled into domestic life in Seneca Falls, New York. She became a mother, eventually raising 7 children. While she loved her family, the daily realities of being a housewife in the mid-19th century felt suffocating. Her brilliant mind, once stimulated by legal theory and political debate, was now consumed by cooking, cleaning, and childcare. She felt isolated, intellectually starved, and increasingly frustrated by the narrow confines of what society called the woman's sphere. She described this period as a time of mental starvation. This personal frustration was a microcosm of the broader social reality for women. They couldn't vote, hold public office, attend most colleges, or enter professions like medicine or law. In the eyes of the law, a married woman had virtually no separate identity from her husband. This system, known as coverture, meant her property, earnings, and even her physical body were legally under her husband's control. Elizabeth saw this not just as unfair, but as a fundamental violation of human dignity. Her own experiences as a wife and mother, combined with her intellectual understanding of the law, fueled her determination. She wasn't just fighting an abstract idea. She was fighting the very system that constrained her own life and the lives of millions of other women. The turning point came in July 1848. Frustrated and restless, Elizabeth was invited to tea with Lucretia Mott and a few other Quaker women. As she vented her long-accumulating discontent, the energy in the room became electric. The pact they had made in London was finally reignited. In a whirlwind of activity, they decided to act immediately. They placed a small, unpretentious ad in the local paper announcing a women's rights convention to be held in Seneca Falls just a few days later. They had no idea if anyone would show up. To their astonishment, over 300 people, men and women, flocked to the Wesleyan Chapel for the 2-day convention. It was here that Elizabeth Cady Stanton truly found her public voice. Standing before the crowd, she read aloud a document she had drafted, modeled on the Declaration of Independence. She called it the Declaration of Sentiments. It began with the audacious words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The document then listed 18 grievances against mankind, mirroring the original Declaration's grievances against King George III. It detailed the legal, social, and economic injustices women faced, from the denial of the right to vote to unequal educational and employment opportunities. It was a powerful and comprehensive indictment of the patriarchal structure of American society. But Stanton went one step further, adding a series of resolutions. The most controversial of these, the 9th resolution, demanded the right for women to vote. This was a truly radical idea, even among her fellow reformers. Many, including her own husband and Lucretia Mott, feared it was too extreme and would make their entire cause seem ridiculous. They urged her to remove it, worried it would jeopardize public support for their other, more achievable goals like property rights. But Elizabeth was adamant. She argued that the power to make laws was the right through which all other rights could be secured. Without the vote, women would always be at the mercy of male legislators. She believed that political equality was the cornerstone of all other forms of equality. Her powerful arguments, combined with the impassioned support of the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who was also in attendance, narrowly convinced the convention to pass the resolution. The Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments marked the official beginning of the organized women's suffrage movement in the United States. Stanton had not only voiced the discontent of women, but had also given them a foundational text and a clear, audacious goal. The public reaction was swift and largely negative. Newspapers across the country mocked the convention, calling the women involved unfeminine and insane. preachers condemned them from the pulpit. Stanton herself was ridiculed, but she was undeterred. In fact, she saw the backlash as a sign of success. "It will start women thinking," she said, "and men too. And when men and women think, the first step in progress is taken." She embraced the controversy, understanding that any profound social change begins by shocking the status quo. For the next 50 years, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the intellectual engine of the women's rights movement. She formed a legendary partnership with Susan B. Anthony, whom she met in 1851. Their skills were perfectly complementary. Stanton, often tied to her home with her growing family, was the writer, the philosopher, and the strategist. Anthony, who was unmarried and free to travel, was the organizer, the public speaker, and the tireless activist. Stanton would write the fiery speeches, and Anthony would deliver them across the country. "I forged the thunderbolts," Stanton famously said, "and she fired them." Together they fought on countless fronts. They campaigned for dress reform, advocating for more practical clothing for women. They fought for more liberal divorce laws, a hugely controversial stance that even alienated some of their allies. Stanton argued that a woman should have the right to leave an unhappy or abusive marriage. But her central focus always returned to the fundamental issue of women's equality in all spheres of life, political, religious, and social. As the years went on, Stanton's views became even more radical. She grew increasingly critical of organized religion, arguing that the Bible and church teachings were a primary source of women's subjugation. This led her to publish The Woman's Bible, a provocative critique of biblical scripture that alienated the more conservative wing of the suffrage movement. For Stanton, however, no institution was too sacred to be challenged in the pursuit of true equality. She believed that to be truly free, women had to be liberated not just from discriminatory laws, but from the oppressive ideologies that underpin them. Elizabeth Cady Stanton never lived to see women get the right to vote. She passed away in 1902, 18 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified, but her legacy is immeasurable. She was a visionary who dared to imagine a world that others could not. She was the voice that articulated the frustrations of generations of women and transformed that discontent into a powerful political movement. She challenged not just laws, but the very way society thought about gender. Her courage, her intellect, and her refusal to compromise on the principle of absolute equality laid the groundwork for the rights many of us take for granted today. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wasn't just asking for a seat at the table. She was demanding that the entire house be redesigned. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the life of a true revolutionary. If you found this story inspiring, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history as game changers. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the lives of the incredible women who shaped history. Today, in Chapter 5, we turn our spotlight to a figure of immense grace, wisdom, and unwavering resolve, Lucretia Mott, the Quaker preacher. Imagine a time when women were expected to be silent, especially in public and religious settings. Now, picture Lucretia Mott, standing before crowds, her voice clear and steady, challenging the deepest injustices of her era. Who was this remarkable woman? Born in Nantucket, Massachusetts in 1793, Lucretia Coffin Mott was raised in the Quaker faith, also known as the Religious Society of Friends. This wasn't just a religion for her. It was the very foundation of her worldview. Quakers believed in the inner light, the idea that a piece of the divine exists in every single person, regardless of race, gender, or social standing. This radical belief in equality put her on a collision course with two of the greatest evils of the 19th century, slavery and the oppression of women. From a young age, Lucretia was a gifted student and thinker. After becoming a teacher, she was outraged to discover that her male colleagues were paid significantly more for the same work. This early experience with gender discrimination planted a seed that would blossom into a lifelong fight for women's rights. but her first public cause was abolition. Lucretia and her husband, James Mott, were fervent abolitionists. Their home in Philadelphia was a known stop on the Underground Railroad, a safe haven for those escaping the horrors of bondage. She wasn't just a supporter from the sidelines. She was an active organizer and a powerful voice in the American Anti-Slavery Society. She co-founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, creating a space for women to take a leading role in the movement when they were often excluded from the main organizations. It was this work that truly honed her skills as a public speaker. At a time when it was considered scandalous for a woman to speak before a mixed audience of men and women, Lucretia Mott did just that. She was a recorded minister in the Quaker community, meaning her gift for ministry was officially recognized. Her sermons weren't fiery tirades. They were rooted in logic, scripture, and a profound sense of moral clarity. She could disarm opponents with her calm demeanor and well-reasoned arguments, making her one of the most respected and effective reformers of her day. People didn't just hear her, they listened. They were moved by the quiet power of her conviction. Her influence was so great that she became a mentor to a new generation of activists. And this is where our story connects with another key figure, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The two met in 1840 at the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Imagine their shock and indignation when, after traveling thousands of miles to participate, they and all the other female delegates were denied seats and forced to sit in a segregated gallery, silenced behind a curtain. It was in that moment of shared humiliation that a powerful friendship and a revolutionary alliance were forged. Stanton, younger and more fiery, was in awe of Mott's wisdom and composure. Mott, in turn, saw the brilliant spark in Stanton. They spent hours walking the streets of London, discussing theology, the nature of injustice, and the need for a movement dedicated solely to the rights of women. Mott told Stanton, "Elizabeth, we must hold a convention and form a society to advocate the rights of women." That conversation planted the seed for what would become the Seneca Falls Convention 8 years later. This brings us to one of Lucretia Mott's most defining characteristics, her leadership style. In a movement filled with passionate and sometimes clashing personalities, Mott was the steady hand, the calm center of the storm. She was principled but not dogmatic, radical in her beliefs but patient in her methods. While others might have been loud and confrontational, Mott's power lay in her quiet persistence and unshakable moral authority. She wasn't interested in personal glory, she was interested in justice. She had a unique ability to bridge divides and bring people together, mediating disputes with grace and wisdom. She reminded her fellow activists to stay focused on the principles of equality and to treat their opponents with respect, even while fiercely opposing their views. Her home was a hub of intellectual and political activity, a gathering place for abolitionists, suffragists, and thinkers of all kinds. To be invited into her circle was to be in the presence of one of the great moral compasses of the 19th century. She wasn't just a preacher in the meeting house. Her entire life was a sermon on the principles of equality, peace, and justice. Lucretia Mott's influence extended far beyond Seneca Falls. She continued to speak right and organize for the rest of her life, championing not only abolition and women's rights, but also religious freedom and peace. She provided the early women's rights movement with its philosophical and moral backbone. Her Quaker belief in the inner light became a powerful argument for women's equality. If God resides in everyone, how could one half of humanity be considered inferior to the other? Lucretia Mott showed the world that leadership doesn't always have to be loud. It can be a quiet, persistent, unyielding force for good. She was the anchor, the mentor, and the conscience of a revolution. Her life is a testament to the power of living one yes principles and the profound impact one person can have when they speak truth with courage and grace. Thank you so much for joining us for this look into the incredible life of Lucretia Mott. Her story is a vital piece of the puzzle, and her steady influence was essential to everything that followed. If you found this story inspiring, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore this amazing history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Imagine this. It's a warm July day in 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, still simmering from her London experience 8 years prior, receives an invitation. Not for a protest, not for a rally, but for tea. This invitation came from Jane Hunt, a respected Quaker woman in Waterloo, New York. And who else was going to be there? None other than Lucretia Mott, the very woman Stanton had bonded with over their shared indignation in London. It was an opportunity Stanton couldn't pass up. So Stanton made her way to the Hunts' beautiful home. There, in the elegant parlor, were Jane Hunt, Lucretia Mott, and another prominent Quaker abolitionist, Mary Ann McClintock. The scene was perfectly domestic porcelain cups, the gentle aroma of tea, polite conversation. But beneath this calm surface, a storm was brewing. As the women talked, the conversation quickly turned from pleasantries to the deep-seated frustrations they all shared. Stanton, ever the passionate orator, unleashed a torrent of grievances. She spoke of her life as a wife and mother, the intellectual starvation she felt, the limitations placed upon her simply because she was a woman. She described the long accumulating discontent she felt, a feeling that resonated deeply with the other women in the room. Lucretia Mott, with her quiet strength and decades of experience in the abolitionist movement, listened intently, nodding in agreement. Jane Hunt and Mary Ann McClintock, both active in social reform, shared their own stories of injustice and constraint. The air in the room crackled with energy. It wasn't just a venting session. It was a collective awakening. They weren't just isolated individuals with private complaints. They were part of a vast, unspoken sisterhood of dissatisfaction. Their personal grievances were, in fact, political. As Stanton later wrote, she poured out the torrents of my long-accumulating discontent with such vehemence and indignation that I stirred myself, as well as the rest of the party, to do and dare anything. And in that moment of shared passion, a truly radical idea was born. It was one thing to complain over tea. It was another thing entirely to take public action. Someone history doesn't record exactly who said it first suggested they hold a convention. Not just any convention, but a convention specifically to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. Think about how audacious this was. In 1848, women couldn't vote, they had virtually no legal rights, and they certainly weren't supposed to organize public meetings to demand change. It was an idea so daring it could have been dismissed as madness. But in that parlor, fueled by tea and righteous anger, it felt like the only logical next step. The energy was electric. They couldn't let this moment fade. Lucretia Mott, the experienced organizer, knew that momentum was everything. She was scheduled to leave the area in just a few weeks. If they were going to do this, they had to do it now. The decision was made with breathtaking speed. The convention would be held the very next week in nearby Seneca Falls. There was no time to waste. The women immediately got to work. Imagine them, gathered around Jane Hunt's small mahogany table, pens scratching furiously on paper. They weren't just planning a tea party anymore. They were drafting a revolution. They wrote an announcement to be published in the local newspaper, the Seneca County Courier. The notice was concise but powerful. It read, "A convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of woman will be held in the Wesleyan Chapel at Seneca Falls, NY, on Wednesday and Thursday, the 19th and the 20th of July current, commencing at 10 o'clock a.m. They made a strategic and somewhat controversial decision for the time. The first day would be exclusively for women. Men would be invited to attend on the second day. With the announcement drafted, a sense of both terror and exhilaration filled the room. They had done it. They had crossed a line. There was no turning back. They were 4 women who, over a simple cup of tea, had decided to publicly challenge the entire structure of their society. They had no idea if anyone would show up. They had no idea if they would be celebrated or ridiculed. All they had was a shared conviction and the courage to act on it. This single, spontaneous gathering was the spark that would ignite the women's rights movement in the United States. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't always made in grand halls or on battlefields. Sometimes it begins quietly in a parlor with a conversation between friends who decide they've simply had enough. Their decision to act, to transform their private discontent into a public demand for justice, would send ripples across the nation and, eventually, the world. The Seneca Falls Convention was no longer just an idea. It was about to become a reality. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. It's truly amazing how a small moment can change everything. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more chapters of this incredible journey. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll see what happens when the doors of the Wesleyan Chapel open for this unprecedented event. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into Chapter 7, a pivotal moment where a simple idea began to transform into a nationwide movement. It all started with a bold decision to call a convention. This wasn't just any meeting. It was a radical act of public assembly for a cause that many considered unthinkable. Imagine the scene. A small group of women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, huddled together, drafting the words that would echo through history. They weren't writing a private letter or a diary entry. They were crafting a public notice, one they intended to print in the local newspaper for all to see. The courage this took is hard to overstate. In the mid-19th century, for women to take such a public stand was to invite scrutiny, criticism, and social ostracism. The notice itself was carefully worded. It was an invitation to what they called a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition of woman. Notice the breadth of that statement. They weren't just talking about one issue, like the right to vote. They were calling for a complete re-examination of a woman's place in every aspect of society. This was revolutionary. They were questioning the very foundations of their world, from the laws that govern them to the religious doctrines that define them. The chosen venue was the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, and the dates were set for July 19th and 20th, 1848. The notice explicitly stated that the first day would be exclusively for women, allowing them a safe and open space to speak freely among themselves before opening the discussion to the general public on the second day. This was a strategic and empowering choice. Once the notice was sent to the Seneca County Courier, there was no turning back. The ink was dry, the type was set, and the message was about to be broadcast to the entire community. As the newspapers rolled off the press and began to circulate, the reaction was immediate and varied. It was a whirlwind of curiosity, skepticism, and, quite frankly, a lot of ridicule. For many, the very idea was laughable. A convention run by women, for women to discuss their rights? It was absurd to some, an amusing novelty to others. Cartoons and satirical articles likely began to circulate poking fun at these discontented women. The term hen convention might have been tossed around with derision. People questioned their motives, their sanity, and their femininity. What more could they possibly want? Was a common dismissive refrain. But alongside the mockery there was a spark of genuine curiosity. The notice was a stone tossed into a still pond, and the ripples of intrigue spread. Some men and women, perhaps those who had privately harbored similar feelings of injustice, were intrigued. Who were these women? What did they have to say? For people who felt the constraints of societal norms, this public call was a beacon of possibility. It was something new, something different, and it promised a discussion that had been silenced for centuries. Let's pause and truly consider the immense risk these organizers were taking. In an era where a woman's reputation was her most valuable asset, going public with such a radical agenda was a form of social suicide for some. They were risking their standing in the community, their relationships with their husbands, fathers, and brothers, and even their welcome in their own churches. They weren't just names on a notice. They were wives, mothers, and daughters who would have to face their neighbors in the street the next day. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, was a mother of several young children. Lucretia Mott was a respected Quaker minister, but even her status didn't fully shield her from criticism. These were not reckless rebels. They were thoughtful, intelligent women who had weighed the consequences and decided that the fight for equality was worth the personal cost. They knew they would be called unwomanly, immodest, and aggressive. They knew they would face scorn and condemnation. Yet they did it anyway. This act of printing a simple newspaper notice was an act of profound bravery. It was a declaration that they would no longer suffer in silence. They were taking the private conversations, the whispered frustrations, and the quiet resentments from the parlors and kitchens and thrusting them into the public square. They were demanding to be heard, not as an appeal for pity, but as a claim for justice. The mixed reactions, the curiosity, the skepticism, the ridicule all served to amplify the event. Every joke, every dismissive comment, paradoxically, also served as publicity. People were talking. The town was buzzing. Whether they planned to attend in support, in opposition, or simply to witness the spectacle. People were now aware that something significant was about to happen in the small town of Seneca Falls. This moment teaches us a powerful lesson about activism. Change often begins not with a roar, but with a clear, deliberate voice choosing to speak up when silence is expected. It's about taking that initial terrifying step into the public eye, willing to endure the backlash for a belief you hold dear. The women who called the Seneca Falls Convention weren't guaranteed success. They had no idea if anyone would show up. All they had was the conviction that the conversation needed to start, and they were the ones who had to start it. And so, as the date of the convention approached, a sense of anticipation filled the air. The notice had been published. The public had reacted. The stage was set. What would happen when the doors of the Wesleyan Chapel opened on that fateful July morning? That is the story for our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me today as we explored this critical moment in the fight for women's rights. The courage to simply call a meeting is a powerful reminder that every great movement starts with a small, brave step. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning. July 19th, 1848. The sun rose over Seneca Falls, New York, painting the quiet summer morning in hues of amber and gold. The air was thick with the usual sounds of a small town waking up, the distant clatter of a milk wagon, the crow of a rooster, the gentle hum of early morning life. But this morning was different. There was an undercurrent of anticipation, a subtle electricity in the air that spoke of something new, something momentous about to unfold. This was the day of the first ever Women's Rights Convention. As the morning light streamed through the windows of homes across the town and the surrounding countryside, women were preparing for their day. But instead of just tending to their usual household chores, many were putting on their best bonnets and shawls, their hearts a flutter of nerves and excitement. They were farmers' wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters. They were women who had spent their lives in the domestic sphere, their worlds largely defined by the walls of their own homes. Today they were stepping out. The destination was the Wesleyan Chapel, a modest but proud brick building on Fall Street. It wasn't a grand hall or an imposing state house. It was a place of community, a place where neighbors gathered, and that's exactly what was happening. From all directions they came, on foot, in buggies, from nearby farms and neighboring towns. The sight was unusual. A steady stream of women, their faces a mix of determination and quiet apprehension, converging on a single point. Most of the attendees were, as expected, women. These were the women who had seen the small notice in the Seneca County Courier just days before, a call to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of woman. It was a phrase that resonated deep within them, touching upon a truth they had long felt but rarely spoken aloud. They were coming to listen, to learn, and perhaps for the very first time to speak, but they weren't entirely alone. Sprinkled amongst the crowd of bonnets were the top hats of men. Some came out of genuine curiosity, others out of solidarity. Perhaps they were husbands, brothers, or fathers who had been persuaded by the passionate arguments of the women in their lives. One notable figure was Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and orator, who saw the fight for women's rights as intrinsically linked to the fight for freedom and equality for all people. His presence lent a significant weight to the proceedings, a powerful endorsement from a leading voice in the struggle for human rights. Imagine what it must have felt like for those women, standing at the threshold of the Wesleyan Chapel. For many, this was the first time they had ever attended a public meeting that was in a church service or a town social. They were about to enter a space to discuss politics, rights, and their place in society, topics that were considered exclusively the domain of men. Every step towards that chapel door was a step into unknown territory. It was an act of quiet courage. They were challenging generations of tradition, defying societal expectations that confined them to the home. They were risking ridicule, disapproval from their communities, and perhaps even tension within their own families. There was no map for what they were doing, no precedent to follow. They were the pioneers. Inside, the chapel buzzed with a low hum of conversation. Women greeted neighbors they knew and sized up strangers, a shared sense of purpose connecting them all. The pews began to fill. The air grew warm with the heat of a July day, and the collective energy of nearly 300 souls gathered together. They were a mix of Quakers, who had a long tradition of recognizing women's spiritual equality, and women from other walks of life who were simply fed up with the status quo. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Martha Wright, Mary Ann McClintock, and Jane Hunt, the organizers, watched as their bold idea became a reality. What had started as a conversation over tea just a week and a half earlier had blossomed into this incredible gathering. The sight must have been both exhilarating and terrifying. They had called the meeting, but would people come? They had. Now, the real work was about to begin. As the clock ticked towards the appointed hour, a hush fell over the room. The women and the few men present settled into their seats. They looked towards the front, their faces upturned with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. They were on the verge of something extraordinary. They were about to participate in a conversation that would ignite a movement. A conversation that would echo through the decades and change the course of history, not just for them, but for generations of women to come. The gathering in that small chapel in Seneca Falls was more than just a meeting. It was a declaration. It was the moment when the silent, private frustrations of countless women found a collective voice. The quiet summer morning had given way to a day that would be anything but quiet. The gathering had begun, and the world would never be quite the same again. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back in time. It's truly inspiring to think about the courage of these first attendees. If you found this story as moving as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more chapters from this pivotal moment in history. We'll see you next time as we delve into the first day of the convention itself. Thanks for watching.
Welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into Chapter 9, stepping right into the heart of the Seneca Falls Convention on that historic morning of July 19, 1848. The air in the Wesleyan Chapel is thick with anticipation. Imagine it. Nearly 300 people, mostly women, but a surprising number of men too, have packed into this modest building. They've come from all over, drawn by a small, unassuming ad in the local paper. They don't quite know what to expect, but they feel the pull of something monumental. As the proceedings are about to begin, a hush falls over the crowd. All eyes turn to the front, where the organizers are gathered. And there, at the center of it all, is Lucretia Mott. She's in her 50s, a renowned Quaker minister and a veteran of the abolitionist movement. Her reputation precedes her. In a time when women were expected to be silent and submissive, Lucretia is a beacon of intellectual firepower and moral courage. She isn't fiery or bombastic. Instead, she possesses a quiet, commanding presence. Her calm demeanor is like the steady center of a spinning wheel. It grounds the room, lends an immediate sense of gravity and purpose to the gathering. For many of the younger women present, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia is more than just a speaker. She's a mentor, a living embodiment of the principles they are about to champion. Her very presence seems to say, what we are doing here is right, and it is necessary. This isn't a radical fringe meeting. With Lucretia Mott here, it's a serious and dignified assembly. The convention opens not with fiery speeches, but with a sense of solemnity and tradition. Following the customs of the day for public gatherings, the morning begins with readings and prayers. This is a deliberate choice. The organizers, especially the Quaker women among them, understand the importance of framing their radical demands within a moral and spiritual context. They aren't rejecting society's values. They're arguing that society has failed to live up to its own highest ideals, both Republican and religious. A passage from the Bible is read, its verses about justice and equality echoing through the chapel with newfound meaning. A prayer is offered, asking for divine guidance and the strength to speak truth. This opening serves a crucial purpose. It sanctifies their cause. It reassures those in the pews who might be feeling hesitant or even frightened. This isn't just a political meeting. It's a moral crusade, blessed and sanctioned. It calms the initial nerves and sets a tone of high-minded purpose for the revolutionary ideas that are about to be unveiled. With the spiritual foundation laid, the time has come to get to the heart of the matter. A 32-year-old mother of 3 from right here in Seneca Falls steps forward. This is Elizabeth. While Lucretia Mott provides the gravitas, Elizabeth provides the fire. She's brilliant, witty, and has spent years feeling stifled by the constraints of domestic life. Now, on this stage, she finds her voice. She's the primary author of the document that will define this convention, and she begins to introduce its central themes. She speaks with a clarity and passion that electrifies the room. She talks about the laws that render married women civilly dead, unable to own property, control their own wages, or have custody of their own children. She speaks of the doors to education and professional life that are slammed shut in women's faces. She points out the hypocrisy of a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal while half its population is denied the most basic rights of citizenship. Her words are not just a complaint, they are an indictment. She lays out the argument, piece by piece, building a case that is both logical and deeply personal. You can feel the energy in the room shift. Nods of agreement become more vigorous. Whispers of "that's right," and "it's true," ripple through the pews. The abstract feeling of discontent that brought these people here is being given a name, a shape, and a voice. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is articulating the unspoken frustrations of a generation of women, and they are listening, spellbound. And with that, the first stirrings of something powerful begin to bubble up. The initial calm and solemnity give way to a palpable excitement. This isn't just another church meeting or a ladies' social. This is history in the making, and everyone feels it. The women in the audience look at each other, a shock of recognition in their eyes. They aren't alone in their frustrations. What they thought were their private, personal struggles are, in fact, a shared, public injustice. This realization is incredibly empowering. But alongside the excitement, a new feeling emerges. Tension. The men in the audience, even the sympathetic ones, begin to shift in their seats. The ideas being discussed are radical, and they challenge the very foundation of social order, of family, of everything they've ever known. Some are intrigued, others are clearly uncomfortable. Even among the women, there's a flicker of fear. What will be the consequences of speaking out so boldly? What will their husbands, their fathers, their ministers say? The chapel is no longer just a room full of people. It's a crucible. The excitement of new possibilities is clashing with the fear of the unknown. The first day of the Seneca Falls Convention has only just begun, and already the room is charged with the thrilling, terrifying, and world-changing energy of revolution. That's where we'll pause for today. We've witnessed the calm before the storm, the powerful opening words that set the stage for everything that was to come. Next time, we will dive into the main event, the reading of the Declaration of Sentiments, and the heated debates that followed. It's a story you won't want to miss. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you're enjoying the series, please take a moment to hit that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. We'll see you then. Hello and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful and revolutionary documents in American history. A text that took the founding principles of the nation and held them up as a mirror to its own injustices. We're talking about Chapter 10. The Declaration of Sentiments. Picture this. It's 1848. The Seneca Falls Convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a brilliant and audacious thinker, stands before a crowd, ready to present a document she's drafted. But this isn't just any document. It's a masterful, daring rewrite of the United States Declaration of Independence. Stanton took Thomas Jefferson's hallowed words and made a simple, yet earth-shattering, alteration. Where Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be so that all men are created equal." Stanton declared, "We hold these truths to be so that all men and women are created equal." With just 2 words, and women, she exposed a fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of the American experiment. The promise of liberty and equality, she argued, was not being extended to half the population. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a radical act of reappropriation. Stanton used the very language of the nation's birth to demand a rebirth of its ideals. She was essentially saying, "You revered these words when they were used to break from a king. Now, you must revere them as we use them to break from the tyranny of patriarchy." It was a bold move, one that required immense courage and intellectual firepower. She was leveraging the emotional and political weight of the Declaration of Independence to frame the fight for women's rights not as a niche issue, but as an essential, unfinished part of the American Revolution itself. The Declaration of Sentiments then follows the structure of its predecessor, laying out a list of injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman. Just as the colonists listed their grievances against King George III, Stanton itemized the injustices faced by women. This wasn't a vague complaint. It was a detailed indictment, a meticulously crafted list of wrongs that painted a stark picture of women's subjugation. Let's look at some of the key grievances. First, property rights. Stanton pointed out that a married woman was civilly dead in the eyes of the law. Any property she owned, any wages she earned, legally belonged to her husband. Think about that for a moment. A woman could work her entire life, but the fruits of her labor were not her own. She had no financial independence, no control over her own economic destiny. This wasn't just unfair. It was a system designed to keep women dependent and powerless. The Declaration of Sentiments called this out directly, demanding that women be recognized as independent economic actors. Next on the list was the systemic denial of education. Stanton argued that man had closed against her all the avenues to wealth and distinction which he considers most honorable to himself. The best colleges, the most prestigious professions, theology, medicine, lower, almost entirely inaccessible to women. This wasn't just about limiting job opportunities. It was about limiting intellectual growth and potential. By denying women an equal education, society was effectively saying that their minds were not as valuable, that their contributions were not needed in the great intellectual and professional debates of the day. The Declaration challenged this head-on, framing education as a fundamental right, essential for human dignity and societal progress. And then, perhaps the most radical demand of all, the one that even some of Stanton's allies found too extreme. The right to vote. The Declaration of Sentiments decries the fact that women were compelled to submit to laws, in the formation of which she had no voice. This was the core of the issue. Without the vote, women were governed without their consent. They were subjects, not citizens. Stanton understood that the ballot was not just a symbol. It was the key to unlocking political power and achieving true equality. It was the tool through which all other rights could be secured and protected. The demand for suffrage was so revolutionary at the time that it was the only resolution at the Seneca Falls Convention that did not pass unanimously. Many feared it would make the entire movement seem ridiculous. But but Stanton and Frederick Douglass, who was also present, argued passionately for its inclusion, insisting that political voice was non-negotiable. The revolutionary tone of the Declaration of Sentiments cannot be overstated. It was intentionally provocative. By mirroring the Declaration of Independence, Stanton was drawing a direct parallel between the colonial struggle for freedom and the women's struggle for rights. She was accusing the men of her era of being the new tyrants, of creating a domestic despotism that was just as unjust as the monarchy the Founding Fathers had overthrown. The document's conclusion is a powerful call to action, vowing to use every instrumentality within our power to effect our object. It promised petitions, lobbying, and a relentless public campaign to change hearts, minds, and, most importantly, laws. The Declaration of Sentiments laid the groundwork for the next 70 years of the women's suffrage movement. It was the movement's foundational text, its mission statement, its battle cry. It articulated with stunning clarity the goals of a movement that would transform American society. The women who signed it were pioneers, putting their names to a document that was ridiculed by many in the press and society at large. They were called unnatural, unladylike, and radical. Yet, they persisted. The story of the Declaration of Sentiments is a powerful reminder that progress often begins with a bold, audacious act of speaking truth to power. It teaches us that the foundational documents of a nation are not static relics. They are living texts that can be reinterpreted and used to push for a more inclusive and just society. Elizabeth Cady Stanton didn't just write a list of complaints. She reframed the entire conversation about equality in America. And by doing so, she and her fellow signatories lit a fire that would eventually lead to the 19th Amendment and continue to inspire movements for equality around the world to this very day. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into such a pivotal moment in history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories about the ideas and people who shaped our world. We'd love to have you as part of our community. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're stepping into Chapter 11, The Shock of Suffrage. Imagine a time when the world was on the brink of massive change, yet some ideas were still considered too bold, too audacious to even whisper. This is where our story picks up, inside a humble chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. In the summer of 1848, the air is thick with anticipation and the courage of pioneers. The Seneca Falls Convention has been a whirlwind of powerful speeches and groundbreaking resolutions. The attendees, mostly women but with a few brave men, have debated property rights, access to education, and professional opportunities. They've drafted a document, the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence, boldly stating that all men and women are created equal. Each resolution passes with spirited, near-unanimous support. The energy is electric. It feels like they are truly reshaping the future. But then comes the 9th resolution. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the convention's chief organizers, stands to read it. The room falls silent. The resolution is simple, yet it carries the weight of a revolution. It calls for the sacred right to the elective franchise, the right for women to vote. Suddenly, the confident atmosphere in the chapel evaporates. A wave of shock and disbelief ripples through the crowd. This was different. This was not just about personal rights or social standing. This was about political power. The room erupts, not in cheers, but in a cacophony of nervous murmurs and outright objections. Even the most ardent supporters of women's rights hesitate. Lucretia Mott, Stanton's mentor and a revered figure in the abolitionist and women's rights movements, turns to her and pleads, "Lizzie, that will make us ridiculous. We must go slowly." She fears that demanding the vote is a step too far, a move so radical it would discredit their entire cause. Many others agree. They worry that the public will mock them, that the newspapers will paint them as fanatics, and that all their hard work on other, more reasonable issues will be undone. The debate that follows is fiery and passionate. Voices rise in protests from all corners of the chapel. "It's too soon," one person argues. "We'll be left out of the country," another exclaims. The fear of ridicule is palpable. These weren't just abstract concerns. In the 19th century, the political sphere was seen as exclusively male territory or rough, corrupt, an unsuitable place for the supposedly pure and domestic woman. To suggest that women should enter this arena was to challenge the very foundation of society's gender roles. It was seen as unnatural, a threat to the family and the nation itself. The fear of failure hangs heavy in the air. If they push for this and fail, it could set their movement back by decades. Elizabeth Cady Stanton stands her ground, her heart pounding. She believes with every fiber of her being that without the vote, all other rights are insecure. How can women protect their property if they can't vote for the lawmakers who create property laws? How can they ensure access to education if they have no say in public policy? To her, the vote isn't just one right among many. It is the cornerstone of citizenship, the key that unlocks all other doors. But her arguments seem to be falling on deaf ears. The opposition is strong, and it comes not just from the men in the room, but from the very women she is fighting for. Just as it seems the resolution is doomed to fail, a powerful voice cuts through the tension. It belongs to Frederick Douglass, the renowned abolitionist and the only African-American attendee at the convention. He rises to his feet, his commanding presence instantly hushing the room. Douglass, who knows firsthand what it means to be denied basic human rights and the power of the ballot, offers an eloquent and impassioned defense of women's suffrage. He argues that he cannot accept the right to vote for himself as a black man if he does not also demand it for women. He speaks of universal liberty and the fundamental injustice of denying half the population a voice in their own government. He connects the struggle for abolition with the struggle for women's rights, framing them as two parts of the same great battle for human freedom. His logic is clear, his conviction unwavering. He reminds the assembly that the power to choose one's rulers is the difference between freedom and servitude. Douglass's speech is a turning point. His credibility and his powerful rhetoric sway many of the doubters. He gives courage to those who are wavering and lends legitimacy to Stanton's radical idea. The mood in the chapel begins to shift once more. Hesitation gives way to a renewed sense of purpose. When the vote is finally called, the resolution passes, but just barely. It is the only resolution of the Seneca Falls Convention that is not approved unanimously. The immediate aftermath is just as the skeptics had feared. The press has a field day, mocking the convention and singling out the demand for suffrage for particular scorn. Newspapers across the country call the women Amazons and describe the event as the most shocking and unnatural incident in the history of womanity. Many of the women who signed the Declaration of Sentiments are so intimidated by the public backlash that they withdraw their signatures. The road ahead looks incredibly difficult, paved with ridicule and fierce opposition. But something irreversible has happened in that small chapel. An idea, once considered unthinkable, has been spoken aloud. A demand, once deemed radical, has been formally declared. The shock of suffrage had tested the resolve of these early pioneers, but it had not broken them. Instead, it ignited a fire. That narrowly passed resolution became the central goal of the women's rights movement for the next 72 years. It set in motion a long, arduous, and ultimately triumphant struggle that would transform not only the United States, but the very definition of democracy around the world. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a pivotal moment in history. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most radical ideas are the ones most worth fighting for. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Imagine the scene, a room buzzing with nervous energy, filled with pioneers of a movement that would change the world. This is the setting for a pivotal moment, a turning point where courage was desperately needed. And into this charged atmosphere steps a figure of immense moral authority. A man who had himself broken the chains of bondage to become one of the most powerful voices for freedom in the nation. This was Frederick Douglass. His presence alone was a statement. Here was a man who had endured the unimaginable, who had fought his way to liberty and dedicated his life to the abolition of slavery. He wasn't just a guest. He was a living testament to the struggle for human rights. The attendees, primarily women fighting for their own right to vote, knew his story. They revered him. And on this day, he had come not just to observe, but to participate, to lend his considerable weight to their cause. As the debate raged on, with some advocating for a more cautious approach, fearing that demanding the vote was too radical and would jeopardize their other goals, A hush fell over the room as Frederick Douglass rose to speak. His voice, seasoned by countless speeches, delivered in the face of hostility and danger, resonated with a profound clarity and strength. He wasn't there to offer tepid support. He was there to champion the cause with every fiber of his being. He began by connecting the struggle for women's suffrage directly to the fight against slavery. For Douglass's were not separate issues. They were two sides of the same coin, two fronts in the same war for universal liberty. He argued passionately that the denial of the right to vote to any group, whether based on race or gender, was a fundamental injustice. It was a contradiction of the very principles the nation claimed to stand for. "Liberty," he might have thundered, his voice filling every corner of the hall, "is not a privilege to be granted to a select few. It is the birthright of all humanity." He dismantled the arguments of the opposition with powerful logic and irrefutable moral reasoning. How could they demand freedom for the enslaved man while denying a voice to the free woman? How could they claim to build a just republic while excluding half of its citizens from the democratic process? He reminded them that the fight for abolition had taught him a crucial lesson. Progress is never won by caution or compromise on fundamental principles. It is won by bold demands, by unwavering conviction, and by standing firm for what is right, no matter how daunting the opposition. He argued that the demand for suffrage was not a liability. It was the very heart of their movement. It was the ultimate expression of equality and self-determination. His words were not just an argument. They were an anointing. He spoke of the inherent intelligence, capability, and moral strength of women. He painted a picture of a better, more just society, a true republic, where every voice mattered, where every citizen had a stake in their own governance. He wasn't just supporting them. He was validating them, empowering them, and urging them to see the profound importance of their own demands. You could feel the shift in the room as he spoke. Doubt began to recede, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Fear gave way to courage. His speech acted as a catalyst, forging a bond of solidarity between the abolitionist movement and the burgeoning women's rights movement. He was showing them that their fight was his fight, that the cause of freedom was indivisible. By the time he concluded, the atmosphere had been transformed. The timid whispers of caution were drowned out by a rising chorus of conviction. Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave, the celebrated orator, the unwavering champion of liberty, had used his voice to sway the room. He had helped them find their own courage, to stand firm and demand nothing less than full equality. It was a defining moment, demonstrating that true allies don't just stand with you, they stand up for you. And in doing so, they help you stand taller yourself. This powerful alliance, forged in a humble meeting hall, would echo through the decades, a testament to the idea that liberty must and will be universal. Thank you so much for joining us for this story today. If you found this moment in history as inspiring as we do, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Start of narration, hello, and welcome back to our series. Today, we're rediving into one of the most pivotal moments in the fight for women's rights. The passage of the resolutions at the Seneca Falls Convention. Imagine the scene. A packed Wesleyan Chapel, the air thick with anticipation, hope, and a fair bit of trepidation. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the start of a revolution. After 2 days of intense discussion, the moment of truth had arrived. The attendees were about to vote on the Declaration of Sentiments and the 11 resolutions that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the other organizers had so carefully drafted. These resolutions were radical for their time. They called for an end to laws that made married women civilly dead, demanded equal rights in education, property, employment, and, most controversially, the right to vote. The first 10 resolutions were debated, but they found a generally receptive audience. These were issues that many women present had experienced firsthand. They understood the injustice of being denied an education, of having their wages legally belong to their husbands, of being shut out of professions. While these ideas were still bold, they resonated with the lived realities of the women in the room. The discussions were passionate, filled with personal stories and a shared sense of frustration. There was a growing feeling of solidarity, a sense that they were not alone in their grievances. The passage of these first 10 resolutions, one by one, built a momentum of empowerment. It was a collective roar against the status quo. But then came the 9th resolution, the one that Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself had insisted on, including, despite the concerns of even her closest allies, including her own husband in Lucretia Mott. It was the resolution demanding the sacred right to the elective franchise, the right to vote. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the chapel shifted. The unity that had been building began to waver. For many, this was a step too far. The idea of women voting was seen as utterly preposterous, something that would open them up to ridicule and discredit the entire movement. You have to remember the context of 1848. The thought was so far outside the realm of possibility that even many progressive thinkers shied away from it. Voices of doubt and fear rose from the floor. Would this one demand sink their entire cause? Would they become a laughingstock? Lucretia Mott herself, a seasoned and respected reformer, had cautioned Stanton, Lizzie, "They will make us ridiculous. We must go slowly." The debate was fierce. The resolution was on the verge of failure. It seemed that the fear of public scorn would win out over the radical vision of political equality. The movement was at a crossroads before it had even truly begun. And just when it seemed all was lost, a powerful voice rose in support. It was Frederick Douglass, the renowned abolitionist and the only African-American attendee at the convention. Douglass, who'd escaped enslavement and become a leading orator for human rights, stood and spoke with profound eloquence. He understood what it meant to be denied a voice, to be disenfranchised. He argued that he could not accept the right to vote for himself as a black man if women were not also granted the same right. He framed women's suffrage not as a separate, radical issue, but as a fundamental component of human liberty. He argued that the power to choose one's rulers and make the laws was the ultimate safeguard of all other rights. Without the ballot, he contended, any gains they made could easily be taken away. His speech was a turning point. Douglass's logic was unassailable, and his moral authority was immense. He connected the struggle for women's rights directly to the broader struggle for universal freedom and justice. He gave the wavering attendees the courage they needed. His intervention transformed the debate from one of caution and fear to one of principle and conviction. He reminded everyone in the room that the fight for justice required boldness, not timidity. When the vote was finally called on the 9th resolution, the room was electric. The resolution passed, but only by a narrow margin. It was a hard-won, nail-biting victory. That narrow pass was perhaps the most significant outcome of the entire convention. It was the moment that the demand for suffrage was officially placed on the agenda of the women's rights movement in America, where it would remain for the next 72 years. The passage of all 11 resolutions, culminating in the controversial suffrage clause, marked the true birth of an organized movement. The women and men who left the Wesleyan Chapel that day were no longer just a collection of individuals with shared grievances. They were now participants in a cause. They had a founding document, the Declaration of Sentiments, and a clear set of goals. The emotional atmosphere was a potent mix of elation, exhaustion, and steely determination. They knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. They knew they would face ridicule and opposition, but they also knew they had taken the first, crucial step. The Seneca Falls Convention lit a fire that would spread across the nation. It inspired a series of subsequent women's rights conventions in cities like Rochester, Akron, and Worcester. The resolutions passed on that July day in 1848 became the blueprint for a generations-long struggle. It was a struggle that would eventually transform American society, securing not only the right to vote but also challenging the very foundations of patriarchy in law, culture, and private life. It all began here, in a small chapel, with a group of brave individuals who dared to imagine a more just and equal world, and who found the courage to demand it. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back to 1848. It's a powerful reminder that great changes often begin with small, courageous steps. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please give this video a thumbs up. And do you want forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do won't miss the next chapter in our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we arrive at a pivotal moment. The closing of the convention. After 2 long, arduous days of debate, deliberation, and impassioned speeches. The time had finally come to bring the proceedings to a close. Imagine the atmosphere in that room. The air wasn't just filled with the scent of old parchment and flickering candlelight. It was thick with a mixture of powerful, conflicting emotions. For many, there was a palpable sense of triumph. They had done it. They had articulated a vision for a new kind of world, a world built on principles they held sacred. They had drafted a document that they believed would echo through the ages. You can almost see the proud smiles, the firm handshakes, the shared glances that said, "We have made history." This was the culmination of everything they had worked for, a moment of profound achievement. The weight of their task had been immense, but in this moment, they felt the lightness of success, the thrill of creating something entirely new. But alongside this triumph, a different feeling crept in, a quiet, gnawing nervousness. The ink on the parchment was barely dry, but the delegates were already thinking about the future, about the world outside that room. What would the reaction be? How would their declaration be received by the powers that be, and by the ordinary people whose lives they hoped to change? This was not just a philosophical exercise. It was a direct challenge to the established order. They knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty. The triumph was real, but so was the apprehension. They had lit a fire, but they couldn't be sure if it would provide warmth and light, or if it would burn out of control. This internal conflict was made visible when the time came to sign the declaration. It was a moment of truth, a personal reckoning for every single person present. Many attendees stepped forward without hesitation. For them, signing was a matter of deep conviction. They dipped their quills in the ink, and with steady hands, they affixed their names to the document. Each signature a personal pledge, a public commitment to the cause. They were not just signing a piece of paper. They were signing away their old lives and embracing a future they were willing to fight for. Each name added was another brick in the foundation of their new world, a testament to their shared belief. However, not everyone was ready to take that leap. Some delegates refused to sign. This wasn't necessarily a sign of cowardice or a rejection of the core ideals. For many, it stemmed from profound, principled disagreement. Perhaps they felt the declaration went too far, or not far enough. Maybe they feared the consequences, the inevitable conflict that would follow. They might have believed in the spirit of the convention, but disagreed with the final wording, the specific grievances listed, or the radical nature of the proposed solution. Their refusal was its own form of bravery, a testament to their intellectual honesty. They stood by their conscience, even when it meant standing apart from their colleagues. This division highlighted the complexity of the moment. There were no easy answers, and honorable people could be found on both sides of the debate. As the convention hall slowly emptied and the delegates began their journeys home, a profound and quiet realization settled over them. It wasn't a loud, dramatic epiphany, but a deep, internal understanding. The world they were returning to was not the same one they had left just a few days earlier. Something fundamental had shifted, whether they had signed the declaration or not. Every person who had been in that room knew they had participated in an event that would irrevocably alter the course of history. Think about that for a moment. They were walking out of a meeting, but they were also walking into a new era. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a future that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The quiet realization was that their actions, their words, their debates, all of it had set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped. They had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. The world as they knew it had ended, and a new one was struggling to be born. It was a somber, awe-inspiring thought that likely kept many of them awake on the long journey home. This closing chapter of the convention wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. It was the moment the theoretical became real, the moment a shared dream was set on a path to becoming a tangible reality. The mix of triumph and nervousness, the division between signers and nuns, and the collective understanding that nothing would ever be the same again, these elements defined the incredible weight and significance of what had just transpired. They had not just concluded a meeting, they had launched a revolution, and the world would hold its breath to see what came next. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into such a critical moment in history. It's a story of courage, conviction, and the complex human emotions that drive great change. If you found this as fascinating as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this one. Your support means the world and allows us to continue exploring the past together. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our series. Today, in Chapter 15, we re-diving into the immediate aftermath of the Seneca Falls Convention and exploring the explosive reactions it ignited across America. The ink on the Declaration of Sentiments was barely dry, and already the nation was buzzing. But the sound wasn't exactly applause. Imagine picking up your morning newspaper in 1848. You scan the headlines, and there it is, a story about a group of women who gathered in a small New York town to demand the right to vote, to own property, to be seen as equals to men. For most of the country, this was beyond radical. It was laughable. Newspaper editors, almost universally men, had a field day. They dipped their pens in ink and sarcasm, churning out articles that dripped with condescension. The women of Seneca Falls were painted as outrageous, unnatural, and shameless. One paper mockingly called the convention the most shocking and unnatural incident ever recorded in the history of women. Another sneered that these women wanted to wear the pants in the family, abandoning their sacred duties at home to meddle in the dirty world of politics. They were characterized as bitter, unattractive spinsters who couldn't find husbands, or as domineering wives trying to usurp their husband's God-given authority. The ridicule was relentless and personal. The editors weren't just disagreeing with the ideas, they were attacking the very character and femininity of the women involved. They used satire to suggest a world turned upside down, men forced to rock cradles and darn socks while women gallivanted off to Congress. The message was clear. This was a joke, a bizarre spectacle not to be taken seriously. The goal was to shame these women back into silence, to make their demands seem so absurd that no sensible person, male or family, would ever support them. But here's the fascinating thing about ridicule. Sometimes it backfires. While the mockery was intended to crush the movement, it had an unintended side effect. It spread the news. Suddenly, people in Boston, Philadelphia, and even as far as Ohio were reading about this scandalous convention. The editors, in their attempt to mock, had reprinted the entire Declaration of Sentiments. They thought publishing the women's own words would be the ultimate punchline, proving just how ludicrous their demands were. Instead, for some readers, it was a revelation. Women who had felt a quiet, nameless frustration in their own lives read those words and felt a flicker of recognition. They saw their own unspoken desires mirrored in the text. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has taken from her all right and property, even to the wages she earns. For these women, it wasn't a joke. It was the truth. So, while the public narrative was one of widespread scorn, a second, quieter story was unfolding. Letters began to travel between women who were inspired by the news. Small groups started meeting in parlors and church basements, whispering about the ideas from Seneca Falls. Yes, there was some admiration, but it was often private and cautiously expressed. To publicly support the convention was to risk your own reputation, to invite the same scorn and ridicule. This brings us to the immense challenge these women faced. They weren't just fighting for legal rights. They were fighting against a deeply ingrained culture. They were pioneers in the truest sense of the word, stepping into a wilderness of social disapproval with no map to guide them. Being a pioneer is never easy. You're the first to face the obstacles, the first to absorb the backlash. Every step forward is met with resistance. Think about the courage it took for Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and the others. They knew they would be mocked. They knew their families might be embarrassed, their husbands' careers potentially damaged. And yet, they did it anyway. They stood on that stage, read their declaration, and signed their names to a document they knew would make them targets. This wasn't a theoretical exercise. It was a profound act of personal and public bravery. The backlash was a test. Would they retreat? Would they apologize and shrink back into the domestic sphere where society insisted they belonged? The pressure was enormous. Some of the women who had signed the Declaration of Sentiments were so intimidated by the public outcry that they asked to have their names removed. The fear of being ostracized, of being labeled unwomanly, was a powerful weapon. But the core group of organizers did not back down. In fact, The harsh criticism seemed to galvanize them. It confirmed what they already knew, that the system was deeply resistant to change and that their work was more necessary than ever. Frederick Douglass, one of the few men to support them unequivocally from the start, wrote a powerful editorial in his newspaper, The North Star, He defended the convention, calling the Declaration of Sentiments the grand basis for attaining the civil, social, political, and religious rights of women. His support was a crucial counter-narrative to the deluge of mockery. So, how do we view the Seneca Falls Convention in light of this reaction? It was, simultaneously, a scandal and an inspiration. For the establishment, it was a scandalous breach of social order, a foolish rebellion to be quashed. For a growing number of women, and some forward-thinking men, it was a beacon of hope. It was the moment the starting gun was fired on a marathon for equality. The ridicule helped define the battle lines. It forced people to take a side. You could either laugh along with the newspapers, reinforcing the status quo, or you could stop and ask, but what if they're right? What if women asterisks? Do asterisks deserve these rights? The convention, amplified by the controversy, inserted the question of women's rights into the national conversation in a way that had never happened before. It's a powerful lesson about social change. Often, the first sign that you're making an impact isn't applause. It's resistance. It's mockery. The fact that the establishment felt the need to push back so hard, to ridicule so fiercely, showed that the ideas presented at Seneca Falls were not just frivolous. They were powerful. They were threatening to the existing power structure, and therefore, they were important. The reactions across America, from the scornful editorials to the quiet whispers of support, all played a role in shaping what would become the women's suffrage movement. The scandal lit a fire, and the inspiration fanned the flames, ensuring that the conversation started in that small Wesleyan Chapel in 1848 would not be silenced. It would grow, evolve, and continue for generations to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of these pioneers is a reminder of the courage it takes to challenge the world as it is in favor of the world, as it should be. If you found this story as compelling as I do, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We have so much more of this incredible journey to explore together. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into Chapter 16, Seeds of a Movement. We've just witnessed the monumental Seneca Falls Convention, a moment that didn't just end when the doors closed. In fact, it was just the beginning. The ripples from that gathering in 1848 started to spread, slowly at first, but with growing momentum, transforming into waves of change across the nation. Imagine the excitement and the sense of possibility that filled the air. Women who had attended Seneca Falls, and many who had only heard about it through newspaper reports, both scornful and supportive, were ignited with a new sense of purpose. They returned to their towns and cities, not just with memories, but with a mission. The Declaration of Sentiments became their blueprint, a powerful document that articulated the injustices they had long felt but perhaps never had the words to express so clearly. And so, the seed of Seneca Falls began to sprout. Just 2 weeks later, a larger convention was held in Rochester, New York. This time, a woman, Abigail Bush, was elected to preside over the meeting, a radical step that was debated even among the attendees themselves. It showed that the movement was not only growing, it was evolving, pushing its own boundaries and challenging the status quo from within. This Rochester convention was a clear sign that Seneca Falls was not a one-off event. It was a model, a replicable formula for action. Soon, this model was being copied across the country. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, state by state, local women's rights conventions began to pop up. Worcester, Massachusetts hosted the first National Women's Rights Convention in 1850, drawing over 1,000 attendees from 11 different states. Think about that for a moment. In an age without social media or instant communication, the news and the spirit of this cause traveled through letters, newspapers, and word of mouth, compelling people to travel long distances, to be part of something bigger than themselves. These gatherings were crucial. They were more than just meetings. They were incubators for ideas and strategies. Here, activists like Lucy Stone, Sojourner Truth, and Antoinette Brown Blackwell, names that would soon become legendary, found their voices and honed their arguments. They debated tactics. Should they focus on property rights, access to education, or the most controversial demand of all, the right to vote? These conventions were where the nuts and bolts of the movement were hammered out. It was also where a powerful network began to form. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, whose partnership would become the engine of the suffrage movement for the next half-century, first met in 1851. Stanton, the brilliant writer and philosopher of the movement, and Anthony, the tireless organizer and public speaker, were a perfect team. Their collaboration, born from the connections forged in these early years, would shape the fight for women's rights for decades to come. They were building a web of communication, sharing speeches, petitions, and strategies. A letter from Stanton in New York could inspire a petition drive in Ohio, which in turn could be reported on at a convention in Massachusetts. This was how the movement grew, organically and persistently. It was a network built on shared conviction and tireless effort. Women began lobbying state legislatures, circulating petitions, and writing articles for sympathetic newspapers. They were learning to be political actors, to navigate a system that was designed to exclude them. They faced ridicule, of course. Cartoons depicted them as mannish and aggressive, abandoning their families. Ministers preached sermons against them, warning that they were defying God's will and the natural order of society. But the criticism, in a way, only strengthened their resolve. For every article that mocked them, another person's curiosity was piqued. For every sermon that condemned them, a woman in the pews might have quietly thought, "But why shouldn't I have a say?" The opposition proved that their ideas were powerful and threatening to the established order. It proved they were making an impact. So, what began as whispers in parlors and quiet conversations among friends was now becoming an organized, public clamor for reform. The isolated sparks of frustration were coalescing into a steady flame. They were no longer just individuals with private grievances. They were a collective, a movement with a name and a purpose. They were learning to speak with one voice, demanding not just small concessions, but a fundamental rethinking of what it meant to be a citizen and a woman in America. The seeds planted at Seneca Falls were germinating in fertile ground. The challenges ahead were immense, and the road to equality would be long and arduous, filled with setbacks and disappointments. But the foundation was laid. The networks were in place, the leaders were emerging, and the core ideas had been articulated. The initial, audacious act of demanding rights had set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped. The movement was alive, it was growing, and it was ready for the long fight ahead. This was the true legacy of those early conventions. The transformation of a revolutionary idea into an enduring, organized struggle for justice. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. If you found this chapter of history as inspiring as I do, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'll see you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our series. Today, we delve into Chapter 17, exploring the unwavering dedication of two giants of history, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Their work didn't end with a single convention or a signed declaration. It was a lifelong battle, a marathon of relentless effort that reshaped the very fabric of society. Let's start with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Imagine dedicating your entire life to a single, monumental cause. For Stanton, that cause was women's suffrage. This wasn't just a hobby or a passing interest. It was her life's work. From the moment the spark was lit at Seneca Falls, she became the intellectual and strategic powerhouse of the women's rights movement. She wrote speeches, drafted petitions, and authored books, all with the singular goal of securing the vote for women. Her commitment was absolute. She saw the ballot not just as a right, but as the key to unlocking all other rights for women's a right to own property, to get an education, to have a voice in the laws that governed their lives. Stanton's journey was far from easy. She raised 7 children, often juggling the demands of motherhood with her revolutionary work. There were times when she felt isolated, writing from her home in Seneca Falls while others were on the front lines. Yet, her pen was her sword. Through her writings, like the monumental history of women's suffrage, she chronicled the movement's struggles and triumphs, ensuring its story would not be forgotten. She challenged not only legal barriers, but also the deeply ingrained social and religious norms that held women back. Her vision was radical and comprehensive, pushing the movement to think bigger and demand more than just the vote. Her commitment never wavered, not for a single day, continuing until her passing in 1902, just a few years before the 19th Amendment would finally be realized. She laid the foundation, stone by painstaking stone, for a victory she would never live to see. Now, let's turn our attention to the equally formidable Lucretia Mott. While often associated with women's rights, Mott's activism began much earlier and was rooted in another profound moral cause: the abolition of slavery. As a devout Quaker, the principles of equality and justice were ingrained in her from a young age. She was a prominent voice in the anti-slavery movement long before she met Stanton. Her home was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and she faced angry mobs for her unyielding stance against human bondage. For Mott, the fight for abolition and the fight for women's rights were two sides of the same coin. They were both struggles for universal human freedom. Her experience of being silenced at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840 was the catalyst that connected these two worlds. She saw firsthand how even within a movement for freedom, prejudice could persist. Mott's dedication to reform was holistic. She championed temperance, peace, and education, believing that a just society required progress on all fronts. Her calm demeanor and powerful moral authority made her a mentor to many, including Stanton. She wasn't just an activist. She was a moral compass, guiding the movements with her wisdom and unwavering principles. Even as she aged, Mott continued to speak, write, and organize. Her spirit a testament to a life spent in service of creating a more just and equitable world for all people, regardless of race or gender. The partnership between Stanton and Mott is one of history's most powerful examples of collaborative genius. They were, in many ways, a perfect pairing. Stanton was the fiery orator, the brilliant writer, the bold strategist who wasn't afraid to push boundaries. Mott, 20 years her senior, was the calm, wise mentor, the moral anchor with deep roots in the abolitionist struggle. Their meeting in London in 1840 was serendipitous. It was a meeting of minds and spirits, a recognition of a shared purpose. Together, they organized the Seneca Falls Convention, an event that would ignite the women's rights movement in America. Stanton brought the intellectual fire, famously drafting the Declaration of Sentiments. Mott brought her credibility, her network from the abolitionist movement, and her steadying presence, which lent legitimacy to their radical demands. Their partnership was a symbol of determination. It showed that real change often requires a combination of bold vision and principled guidance. They supported each other, challenged each other, and amplified each other's strengths. Stanton once called Mott the moving spirit of their work. Their bond represented the fusion of radical new ideas with a long-standing tradition of social reform. This synergy created a force that was far greater than the sum of its parts, a partnership that not only launched a movement, but also provided a model for effective, intergenerational activism that continues to inspire us today. But this dedication came at a tremendous cost. We must never forget the sacrifices Stanton, Mott, and their fellow reformers made. In a society that expected women to be silent and submissive, their actions were seen as scandalous. They faced constant social exclusion. Friends and even family members turned their backs on them. They were ridiculed in the press, depicted in cartoons as unladylike and aggressive. The word harridan was often thrown at them. This wasn't just light criticism. It was a relentless campaign of public shaming designed to silence them. Beyond the social ostracism, there were personal sacrifices. Stanton, as we've mentioned, juggled her activism with raising a large family, often feeling the strain of her dual roles. Mott faced threats of violence for her abolitionist work. These women put their reputations, their safety, and their personal comfort on the line every single day. They traveled under difficult conditions, spoke to hostile crowds, and constantly battled exhaustion and discouragement. They chose a path of immense difficulty because their conviction was stronger than their fear. They paid the price for their principles, enduring criticism and sacrificing personal peace for the promise of a better future. Their struggle reminds us that progress is never free. It is bought with the courage, persistence, and sacrifice of those who dare to challenge the status quo. Their legacy is not just in the rights we have today, but in the powerful example of their resilience in the face of overwhelming opposition. So, as we reflect on the lives of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, we see more than just historical figures. We see the embodiment of lifelong commitment. Stanton's focused, fiery pursuit of suffrage and Mott's broad, principled dedication to universal reform created a partnership that changed the world. They faced ridicule and isolation, sacrificing personal comfort for a cause greater than themselves. Their story is a powerful reminder that significant change is a long, arduous journey, often carried on the shoulders of those who may not live to see the final destination. Their legacy is a testament to the power of unwavering determination and the profound impact of a life dedicated to justice. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this incredible chapter of history. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please give this video a thumbs up, and do not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next installment. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, in Chapter 18, we witness the movement transforming as other voices rise. The seeds planted at Seneca Falls are beginning to sprout in unexpected and powerful ways, bringing new energy, new faces, and new challenges to the fight for equality. The first generation of reformers lit the spark. But now, a new wave is ready to fan it into a roaring flame. Imagine a school teacher from a Quaker family, a woman with a sharp mind and an unyielding sense of justice. Her name was Susan B. Anthony. In the early 1850s, her path fatefully crossed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton's, and one of history's most powerful partnerships was born. Stanton, the brilliant writer and philosopher, and Anthony, the tireless organizer and strategist, were the perfect complements. While Stanton often worked from home, raising her children and crafting the movement's powerful arguments, Anthony took to the road. She was the boots on the ground, crisscrossing the country, delivering speeches, organizing petitions, and facing down hostile crowds with unwavering courage. Anthony's entry into the movement marked a pivotal moment. She brought a level of discipline, focus, and relentless drive that would help sustain the cause through decades of struggle. She wasn't at Seneca Falls, but she would become one of the most recognized and iconic leaders of the entire suffrage movement. And she wasn't alone. A new generation of reformers was stepping onto the stage, building on the foundation laid by women like Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Think of Lucy Stone, another formidable voice who, after graduating from Oberlin College, became a powerful anti-slavery and women's rights lecturer. She was famous for her captivating speeches and for a radical personal choice. She kept her own last name after marriage, a bold statement of identity that inspired a generation of women who came to be known as Lucy Stunners. These younger activists were not just followers, they were leaders in their own right. They established new organizations, published newspapers, and developed innovative strategies for political action. They were educated, articulate, and deeply committed, creating a groundswell of support and building momentum that the political establishment could no longer ignore. This infusion of new blood and fresh ideas ensured the movement wouldn't fade away with its founders. It was becoming a self-sustaining force, gaining strength and diversity with each passing year. However, as the movement grew, it also began to experience its first significant internal fractures. The fight for women's rights was deeply intertwined with another great moral crusade of the era, the abolitionist movement, the fight to end slavery. Many of the leading suffragists, like Stanton, Anthony, and Stone, were also passionate abolitionists. They saw the two causes as linked, part of a broader struggle for human rights and universal freedom. For a time, the two movements worked hand in hand, sharing platforms, resources, and supporters. Abolitionist leaders like Frederick Douglass were powerful allies, speaking eloquently in favor of women's suffrage. He had been there at Seneca Falls, after all. It seemed like a natural and unstoppable alliance, to mighty rivers flowing toward the same sea of justice. But difficult questions began to emerge, creating tensions that would eventually lead to a painful split. As the Civil War approached and then concluded, the political focus shifted squarely to the rights of newly freed African American men. The 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were drafted, promising citizenship and the right to vote. But there was a catch. For the first time, the word male was explicitly written into the Constitution in connection with voting rights. This was a devastating blow to the women who had worked for decades for both abolition and suffrage. They were faced with a terrible choice. Should they support amendments that granted suffrage to black men, while explicitly excluding all women? Or should they oppose them, potentially jeopardizing the hard-won progress for African Americans? This dilemma created a deep and bitter division within their ranks. This conflict split the once unified front. One faction, led by Stanton and Anthony, argued that this was the moment to demand universal suffrage for everyone. They felt betrayed, believing that their abolitionist allies were abandoning them by prioritizing the vote for black men over the vote for women. They formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, which focused on a federal constitutional amendment for women as suffrage and took on a broader range of women as rights issues. On the other side, leaders like Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell, along with prominent abolitionist allies, urged patience. They argued that this was the Negro SOR and that pushing for women as suffrage at the same time could endanger the passage of the 15th Amendment. They formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, which focused on a state-by-state strategy to win the vote. This split was heartbreaking for many who had fought side by side for years. It revealed the complex and sometimes conflicting priorities within social justice movements and set the stage for decades of parallel and sometimes competing efforts. These divisions, though painful, were also a sign that the movement was maturing and expanding far beyond its original circle of founders. It was no longer a small, cohesive group with a single vision. It was becoming a national conversation, drawing in people from different backgrounds with different priorities and strategies. New leaders were emerging not just in the Northeast, but across the country, from the Midwest to the newly settled West, where more progressive ideas about women's roles were sometimes taking hold. The cause was bigger than any single person or organization. It had taken on a life of its own, fueled by the diverse voices of thousands of women and men who believed in a more just and equitable future. The movement was becoming a mosaic of different ideas and approaches. Some focused on the constitutional argument for equality, while others emphasized women's unique moral qualities as a reason they should participate in public life. Some pursued a federal amendment, while others chipped away at discriminatory laws at the state and local levels. This diversity of tactics, while sometimes causing friction, also gave the movement resilience. When one path was blocked, another could be pursued. The conversation was no longer confined to parlors and conventions. It was happening in town halls, on lecture circuits, and in the pages of newspapers across the nation. So, as we close Chapter 18, we see a movement in transition. The pioneering generation has been joined by a powerful second wave of activists, led by dynamic figures like Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone. This new energy is building incredible momentum, but is also bringing complexity and conflict. The painful split with former abolitionist allies over the 15th Amendment has fractured the movement, creating two distinct organizations with different strategies. Yet, even in division, there is growth. The cause of women's rights is expanding, its voices multiplying, and its roots deepening across the country. The original vision of Seneca Falls is no longer a dream shared by a few. It is a national cause, poised for a long and determined struggle. What happens next will define the fight for generations to come. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this look into the new voices and early divisions of the movement was insightful. If you found this interesting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more chapters in this incredible story. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 19, a period premeta Kai, the Long Road, stretching from 1848 to 1920. This isn't just a story of years passing. It's a testament to unwavering perseverance, a chronicle of a fight that spanned generations. We're talking about the women's suffrage movement in the United States, a struggle that was anything but swift or easy. Imagine dedicating your entire life to a cause, knowing you might never see the finish line. That was the reality for the pioneers of women's suffrage. The road from the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 to the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 was paved with incredible hardship and relentless effort. It was a 72-year marathon, not a sprint. This wasn't a single, glorious battle. It was a grueling war of attrition fought on countless fronts. The progress was achingly slow. For every small step forward, it often felt like they were pushed 2 steps back. The movement faced immense opposition, not just from men in power, but from a society steeped in tradition, a culture that had very rigid ideas about a woman's proper place. The suffragists were ridiculed. They were dismissed as radical. They were called unfeminine, and they were told their demands would unravel the very fabric of society. But did they give up? Absolutely not. They organized. They strategized. They employed every nonviolent tactic they could devise. This was a movement built on sheer grit and determination. They undertook massive petition drives, gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures, which they would then physically hold to the halls of Congress, only to be ignored time and time again. Think about the logistics of that. In the 19th century, no internet, no social media just stylus, persante person, effort. They organized parades and marches, spectacular public displays designed to capture attention and demonstrate their numbers and their commitment. These weren't just casual strolls. The 1913 woman suffrage procession in Washington, D.C., for instance, saw thousands of women march down Pennsylvania Avenue. They were met with jeers, insults, and even physical violence from hostile crowds, while the police often stood by and did little to protect them. Yet, they marched on, holding their banners high, a powerful, visible symbol of their demand for justice. They lobbied politicians relentlessly, year after year, Congress after Congress. They drafted amendments, gave speeches, and published newspapers and pamphlets to educate the public and build support. They held conventions and meetings across the country, building a grassroots movement from the ground up, one town, one state at a time. This was a sophisticated political campaign, long before modern campaign tactics were even a concept. And then came the arrests. The Silent Sentinels, led by Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party, took a more confrontational approach. Starting in 1917, they began picketing the White House, a radical act at the time. They stood silently at the gates, holding banners with pointed questions for President Woodrow Wilson, like, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Their peaceful protest was met with hostility. The women were arrested on flimsy charges like obstructing traffic. They were sent to prison, where they faced brutal conditions. When they went on hunger strikes to protest their treatment, they were subjected to torturous force feedings. News of their mistreatment leaked out, shocking the nation and, ironically, generating more sympathy for their cause. These women were not criminals. They were political prisoners, willing to sacrifice their own bodies and freedom for the right to vote. This long, arduous journey took a profound personal toll. Think of the giants of the early movement: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony. These brilliant, courageous women ignited the flame at Seneca Falls. They dedicated their entire adult lives to the cause. They wrote the speeches, planned the strategies, and endured the scorn of a nation. They traveled tirelessly, giving lectures and organizing, often at great personal expense and sacrifice. Yet, despite their monumental efforts, none of them lived to cast a legal ballot in a national election. Stanton died in 1902. Susan B. Anthony, who had become the very symbol of suffrage, passed away in 1906. Her reported last public words were, "Failure is impossible." It's a heartbreaking reality that these founders never got to see the ultimate victory. They laid the foundation, tilled the soil, and planted the seeds, but they would not be there for the harvest. But their legacy is not one of failure. It's one of profound faith and vision. The seeds they planted with such care and watered with their tears and sweat did not die. Instead, they grew. A new generation of leaders, like Carrie Chapman, Kat, and Alice Paul, picked up the torch. They built upon the foundation laid by their predecessors, adapting their strategies to a new century, but never losing sight of the ultimate goal. The world was changing. Women's roles during World War I, where they took on jobs to support the war effort, made it increasingly difficult to argue they were undeserving of the vote. The political pressure, built up over decades of relentless campaigning, finally became impossible for politicians to ignore. And so, in 1920, the moment finally arrived. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, declaring that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The seed that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott had planted in a small chapel in Seneca Falls 72 years earlier had finally, against all odds, blossomed. The long road had reached its destination, but it's crucial to remember that this victory wasn't the end of the story. For many women, particularly women of color, the fight for true voting equality would continue for decades more. The 19th Amendment was a monumental milestone, a hard-won triumph, but it was also a stepping stone on the longer journey toward a more perfect union. The story of these 72 years reminds us that progress is often slow, that change is hard, but that with perseverance, courage, and an unwavering belief in a just cause, what once seemed impossible can eventually become inevitable. Thank you so much for joining me today to reflect on this incredible chapter of history. It's a story of resilience that still inspires us. If you found this video meaningful, please give it a like, share it with someone who might appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. We'll see you next time. And so, we arrive at the final chapter of our journey, a moment to reflect on the enduring legacy of Seneca Falls. It's almost hard to imagine, isn't it, that a small, two-day gathering in a modest chapel in upstate New York could send ripples across time, fundamentally reshaping the very fabric of society. It began not with a thunderous roar, but with the determined whispers of women who believed in a future that few could even conceive of. They got that, not as renowned politicians or powerful figures, but as mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. They were ordinary people, fueled by an extraordinary conviction that the self-evident truths of their nation should apply to all its citizens, regardless of gender. Think about that for a moment. In an era when women were legally and socially subordinate, when their voices were silenced in public forums and their potential was confined to the domestic sphere, a group of individuals dared to draft a declaration of sentiments. They dared to list their grievances, to demand the right to own property, to pursue education, to enter professions, and most audaciously of all, to vote. It was a radical act, a courageous leap of faith into an uncertain future. These weren't seasoned activists with a roadmap for revolution. They were pioneers charting a new course with nothing but their intellect, their shared experience, and an unshakable belief in justice. What we can draw from their story is the immense power of collective courage. Imagine the conversations that took place over tea, the letters exchanged, the anxieties shared in hushed tones, the fear of ridicule, of social ostracism, of being dismissed as radical or unwomanly, was very real. Yet, they found strength in each other. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Martha Coffin, Wright, Marion McClintock, Jane Hunt, and the nearly 300 others who attended formed a bond forged in the fires of shared purpose. They understood that their individual voices might be easily ignored, but together, they could create a chorus that would be impossible to silence. This legacy is not just about the specific rights they fought for, it's about the very act of speaking up. It is a testament to the fact that history is not only shaped by grand battles and sweeping decrees, but also by quiet, persistent acts of courage. It's in the decision to sign a petition, to attend a meeting, to have a difficult conversation with a neighbor, or simply to believe that a better world is possible and to take one small step toward it. The women of Seneca Falls showed us that you don't need a grand stage to change the world. Sometimes, all you need is a room full of people who care. The 72 years that followed, from Seneca Falls in 1848 to the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, were a long and arduous struggle. It was a marathon, not a sprint, carried on the shoulders of successive generations. The pioneers of the movement, like Stanton and Susie Ann B. Anthony, did not live to see the national victory they had set in motion. They passed the torch to younger activists like Carrie Chapman, Catt, and Alice Pohl, who adopted new strategies and faced new challenges. This continuation of the struggle is, in itself, a core part of the legacy. It teaches us that significant social change is a relay race, where each generation has a responsibility to carry the baton forward. And this brings us to the most vital part of our reflection: the unfinished work. The Seneca Falls Convention was a starting point, not a destination. The right to vote was a monumental victory, a key that unlocked countless doors, but it did not instantly erase centuries of inequality. The promise of equality articulated in that chapel in 1848 is a promise that every generation must strive to fulfill anew. The fight for equal pay, for representation and leadership, for an end to systemic biases, and for the protection of the rights of all women, especially those from marginalized communities, continues to this day. The work of equality is not a historical artifact to be admired in a museum. It is a living, breathing endeavor that calls for our participation. It requires us to look at our own communities, our workplaces, and our homes, and ask the same questions the women of Seneca Falls asked: who is being excluded? Whose voice is not being heard? What injustices are we accepting as normal? Their legacy challenges us not to be passive observers of history, but active participants in its making. It reminds us that progress is not inevitable. It is earned through persistence, courage, and a collective commitment to justice. As we conclude, let's take a moment for calm reflection. Picture that chapel in July of 1848. The air is thick with anticipation. The words of the Declaration of Sentiments hang in the air, a bold and audacious dream. The women and men in that room did not know if their efforts would succeed. They only knew that they had to try. They planted a seed of hope, a seed of rebellion, a seed of a more just and equitable world. That seed has grown into a mighty tree, its branches extending into every aspect of our lives, offering shade and shelter we often take for granted. But a tree must be nurtured. Its roots must be tended to, and its growth must be guided. The legacy of Seneca Falls is not just a story about the past. It is a mirror reflecting our present and a compass pointing toward our future. It is a call to action, a reminder that ordinary people, united by an extraordinary vision, can indeed change the world. The work is not finished, and the journey continues. It continues with us. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. I hope these stories have inspired you as much as they've inspired me. If you enjoyed this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the moments that shaped our world. Your support means everything. Until next time, take care.